Stop for a moment and then look around you. Are you certain you understand the history of the world you inhabit? From childhood, we've been fed a linear narrative of progress. First came primitive tools, then the wheel, followed by the steam engine, and finally the smartphone. But what if I told you this line is broken? What if modern humanity isn't the pinnacle of evolution, but merely the feral descendants who settled among the ruins of a far more advanced civilization, claiming its achievements as our own? Today, we're going to expose one of the most obvious yet systematically ignored facts of our reality. We're talking about colossal bridges and viaducts that lead absolutely nowhere. Massive engineering structures standing in the middle of endless fields, dense forests, and desolate valleys where, according to official history, there were never any major cities or industrial centers. Historians would have us believe that in the 19th century, when the primary mode of transportation was the horse and wagon, and the world's population was a fraction of what it is today, rulers and industrialists suddenly decided to build infrastructure designed to last millennia. Sounds noble, doesn't it? Planning for future generations, infrastructure built with room to grow. But let's set aside sentimentality and engage cold logic and basic arithmetic. History isn't a fairy tale about benevolent kings. It's fundamentally about economics, resources, and logistics. Ask any construction engineer, and they'll tell you that building a bridge is one of the most complex and expensive engineering undertakings imaginable. We're talking millions of dollars, even by today's standards. Now imagine yourself as a 19th century capitalist. Your goal is profit. Would you invest colossal sums equivalent to modern billions into constructing a massive stone viaduct in the middle of nowhere, where only a handful of villages exist, hoping that maybe in 100 years someone might build a city there? The answer is self-evident. Nobody freezes capital in stone without a guarantee of immediate returns. Infrastructure always, and I mean always, follows population and demand, never the other way around. First comes the city, the factory, the trading hub, and only then do roads and bridges extend toward it. Yet we observe the exact opposite. Look at the viaducts scattered across Scotland, the Saxon regions of Germany, the American heartland, or the Russian provinces. These are cyclopean structures of red brick or dressed stone, consisting of dozens of arches as tall as 10-story buildings. The official plaques read, "Built in 1840 or 1850. We're told these were constructed for railways. But take a closer look at the width of these bridges. Many are designed for 4 or even 6 parallel tracks. For what purpose? In the mid-19th century, locomotives were a rarity. Trains ran once a week and a single track would have been more than sufficient. Why build excess capacity that we don't fully utilize even now, in the 21st century? From an economic standpoint, it's suicide unless these bridges were built by those for whom moving 1,000 tons of cargo per minute was everyday reality. Let's dive into details that make official historians extremely uncomfortable. Let's talk about materials. Consider the famous Gulch Viaduct in Germany, the largest brick bridge on Earth. Its length exceeds 1,600 feet. Its height reaches 255 feet. Officials claim that 26 million bricks were used in its construction. 26 million. Let that number sink in. We're told it was built in just 5 years, from 1846 to 1851. Let's do the math. A year has 365 days. 5 years equals roughly 1,800 days. To lay 26 million bricks, workers would have needed to place 14,000 bricks daily. No weekends, no holidays, no winter breaks. And this isn't simple barn wall construction. This is an intricate arch system requiring perfect geometry, precise load calculations, and time for mortar to cure. But the speed of construction isn't even the main question. Where did these bricks come from? There are no massive factories in the vicinity capable of producing such volumes. To fire 26 million bricks, you need mountains of coal and enormous kilns. Where's the evidence of this industry? Where are the quarries from which clay was extracted? The surrounding landscape is pristine, no slag heaps, no kiln foundations. It's as if the bricks materialized from thin air. Or far more likely, This bridge stood there long before people with measuring instruments arrived and took credit for its construction. Here's another inconvenient fact: logistics. In the mid-19th century, roads were muddy dirt tracks. How do you deliver millions of tons of building materials to a construction site deep in a forest or mountain pass? By wagon, picture an endless procession of hundreds of thousands of carts hauling bricks, stone, cement, tools, and provisions for an army of workers around the clock. The roads would simply vanish under such traffic, churned into impassable mire. Yet historical records contain no mention of transportation chaos or massive supply operations. Only brief notes about opening dates and architects' names. It's as if we're being shown the final act of a play while the fact that the set was built by an entirely different crew remains hidden. Let's approach the supports of these cyclopean bridges up close. These aren't random piles of rocks held together with lime mortar. These are masterpieces of engineering thought, with execution quality that often surpasses modern standards. We're told they were made by illiterate laborers, yesterday's peasants armed with chisels, hammers, and wooden squares. Have you ever tried working granite with chisel? Granite is one of the hardest rocks on Earth. To carve a block of perfect geometric form from it, you need steel tools with diamond coating or carbide tips, materials that officially didn't exist in the mid-19th century. Iron of that era was soft. It would dull against granite after every 10 strikes. Yet on these viaducts, we see thousands upon thousands of such blocks, fitted together so precisely that you couldn't slide a razor blade between them. This is what's called polygonal masonry, or perfect block assembly without mortar. The stones hold together through their own weight in the flawless contact of their surfaces. Skeptics will argue they had plenty of time and cheap labor. That's the favorite argument of official science when facts become inconvenient. But time is money, and cheap labor means low skill. To create such a bridge, every mason would need to be a virtuoso. Where were these armies of virtuosos trained? In parish schools? And most importantly, where are the marks of their tools? On the stones, we often observe strange traces, either perfectly smooth cuts as if a knife passed through butter, or distinctive grooves that only a high-speed circular saw or milling machine could leave. We're looking at machine processing. This is a fact frozen in stone. Alternatively, these blocks weren't carved at all. They were painted. The technology of geopolymer concrete or artificial stone, whose secret was supposedly discovered only in the 20th century, may have been known to the builders of these viaducts. They simply ground up local rock, added a binding agent, and poured it into forms. This explains the speed, the absence of quarries, and the perfect fitting. But if they possess stone casting technology, this completely changes the picture of our civilization's development. It means the industrial age didn't begin with Watt's steam engine, but was inherited from those who had mastered chemistry and physics at an unreachable level. Let's turn to demography, a science that doesn't tolerate lies. Constructing a massive structure requires concentrating enormous numbers of people. Think of the building of the Transcontinental Railroad or the Hoover Dam, entire temporary cities, hospitals, cemeteries, supply, warehouses. Tens of thousands of people need somewhere to sleep, something to eat, somewhere to relieve themselves. Around any major 19th century viaduct standing in the wilderness, there should be remains of a vast construction camp infrastructure. Barracks foundations, latrine pits, mountains of broken dishes, lost tools, graves of accident and epidemic victims. But archaeologists find nothing there. Emptiness. Untouched earth, as if the bridge descended from the heavens on helicopters. Or perhaps it stood there for centuries, and 19th century builders merely performed cosmetic repairs, painting railings and laying tracks. Look at old daguerreotypes and photographs from the mid-19th century, the era when photography was just emerging. What do we see in images of cities and engineering structures? Emptiness. Magnificent squares of St. Petersburg, Paris, Rome, Berlin, and not a soul. monumental bridges with no wagons crossing them. Historians explain this away with long camera exposures. Supposedly, people moved and blurred, vanishing from the frame. This is a lie designed for amateurs. With exposures of several minutes, moving objects leave ghostly trails and blurred streaks. But there are no trails in these photos. The streets are dead. Cities stand empty as if after a neutron bomb. And amid these lifeless backdrops stand brand new, pristine giant bridges and viaducts. For whom were they built? Where are the millions of residents who should be using this infrastructure? Population statistics from that era show numbers that in no way match the scale of construction. We're told of booming urban growth, but if you take official census data and compare it to the volume of housing stock and infrastructure, a paradox emerges. The infrastructure was designed for a population 5 to 10 times larger than what was officially recorded. Who lived in these cities before us? Where did these people disappear to? A persistent impression forms that modern humanity arrived to find everything ready-made. Like squatters occupying an abandoned mansion, we discovered these cities and bridges, dug them out from layers of mud, gave them our names, and began using them without even understanding their true purpose. Consider railway gauge. Why does virtually the entire world, with rare exceptions, use a standard gauge close to 4 feet 8.5 inches? We're told this is inherited from the width of Roman chariot axles. Seriously, you're suggesting that 19th century engineers, creating cutting-edge transportation, based their designs on 2,000-year-old wagons? Or perhaps the truth is that the gauge was dictated by already existing tracks and bridges. We simply couldn't make trains wider because they wouldn't fit through existing tunnels or across existing viaducts. We merely adapted to the standards of an ancient global network. These bridges weren't built for steam locomotives. A steam locomotive is a primitive furnace on wheels that barely drags its own weight. Viaducts, with their colossal load capacity and width, were intended for entirely different transport-heavy, high-speed, possibly using principles of motion other than wheel-on-rail friction. Now let's look downward, not at the water flowing beneath the bridge, but at the ground from which these gigantic supports rise. Have you ever noticed the strange disproportion of many viaducts? Massive arches that seem too squat, as if a giant had been buried up to the knees in concrete. Official science calls this foundation peculiarities or soil deposits, the so-called cultural layer. Supposedly, over a century or two, a meter or two of dust and debris accumulates. But wait, we're not talking about cities with dense development. We're talking about viaducts in fields and forests. Where would 3, 5, or sometimes 10 meters of cultural layer come from there? Who was littering in the deep wilderness so intensively that they changed the horizon level? The reality is that these bridges don't just stand on the ground, they've grown into it. More precisely, they were buried. When excavations are conducted at the base of many old bridges during restoration work, a shocking picture emerges. The supports extend deep below, and there, beneath layers of clay and sand, continuations of the arches are discovered, full stories that were once above ground. Engineers never design elegant arches with the intention of immediately burying them in earth. That's a senseless waste of effort and a weakening of the structure. For foundations, solid monoliths are used. If there's an arch underground, it means that once upon a time, air, water, or a road passed through it. This is irrefutable evidence that the planet's ground level rose sharply quite recently in the mid-19th century. We've arrived at a monstrous event whose traces they're trying to erase from textbooks, a global flood or catastrophic mudflow that covered most of the continents in a clay mass. Look at the rivers flowing beneath these giant viaducts. Usually they're pathetic streams you could jump across. They're out of proportion with the bridge's grandeur. A viaduct half a mile long spans a river 15 feet wide. Geologists tell us the river shrank, but the valley shapes tell a different story. These lowlands were carved by colossal water masses moving in a broad front. The bridges were built precisely over these once mighty waterways, or over densely populated lowlands now buried under layers of clay. That's why these bridges lead nowhere. These aren't design errors. They're surviving fragments of a destroyed network. Imagine embankment roads were washed away, settlements in the lowlands were destroyed and buried in silt, but the heavy stone bridges remain standing like dinosaur skeletons. Survivors or new settlers simply laid their dirt paths over the deposits, connected their rails to the portions of bridges that remained above the surface, and declared it their own achievement. This explains why the approaches to many bridges look absurd steep inclines. Strange embankments obviously added later to somehow connect the severed levels. Now correlate this with the phenomenon of buried building floors found worldwide in Moscow, Paris, New York, Omaha. Everywhere we see buildings whose first floors are sunk into the ground and converted to basements, windows facing soil, doors leading to underground nowhere. They lied to us about building settlement and supposedly fashionable construction methods, but a bridge cannot settle 10 meters and remain intact. The clay that buried the first floors of cities is the same clay concealing the foundations of great viaducts. These are traces of the same catastrophe. And here the most chilling question arises. What happened to the population? If a cataclysm of such magnitude occurred that it changed valley geography and raised ground level by meters, this means the death of millions, perhaps billions. 19th century demographic statistics begin to crack. Strange gaps in data, mass migrations, the appearance of enormous numbers of orphans. Remember the orphan trains in America, when tens of thousands of children were shipped from cities and distributed to farms? Where did so many homeless children come from in supposedly peacetime? Where were their parents? Why were hundreds of orphanages opening worldwide in the mid-19th century? The answer is terrifying in its simplicity. The adult population that built and operated these magnificent structures was annihilated, washed away, buried, killed by the aftermath of catastrophe, famine, and cold. Children remained, along with a handful of survivors who lost all technology and knowledge. A reset occurred. Humanity was thrown backward in development. We settled among ruins, dug out what we could, and started life anew, inventing a fairy tale about gradual evolution and technological progress. We look at bridges built by titans of the past and attribute their authorship to ourselves, so we don't go mad with horror at realizing we live atop a graveyard of a great civilization. But there's more. If these bridges are remnants of a transportation system, what exactly were they transporting? Why is their construction so excessively strong? Strip the veil from your eyes and look at these structures not as roads for wagons, but as elements of a giant technical schematic. Let's talk about materials. What are these viaducts built from? Red brick and granite. Geologists and physicists know that red brick, fired at certain temperatures, contains iron oxide and acquires semiconductor properties. The granite from which the supports and keynotes are constructed is saturated with quartz. Quartz is a piezoelectric. If you compress a quartz crystal, it generates electric current. This is 8th grade physics. Now imagine a viaduct weighing millions of tons. Gravity presses on the granite supports with monstrous force. Quartz crystals in the stone structure are under constant static stress. This construction is a giant piezoelectric generator operating 24 hours a day simply because it's heavy. But there's more. Notice where these bridges stand. They're always spanning water obstacles, even if there's barely any water now. Moving water isn't just liquid, it's an electrolyte, a moving conductor. Water flow creates a weak electromagnetic field. The bridge's arched construction, like a lens or resonator, focuses and amplifies these fields. We look at a viaduct and see a road, but our ancestors saw a power bus, an element of a circuit. Remember the metal brackets and braces holding stones together in ancient masonry? Officially, they're for strength, but why bind stones with iron that rusts and expands, destroying the stone from within? That's engineering nonsense, unless these braces served as conductors connecting stone blocks into a unified electrical circuit. Now let's scale up the picture. Look at a map showing these bridges to nowhere and overlay it on a map of so-called Star fortresses, strange earthwork fortifications in star shapes scattered across the planet. You'll see a frightening pattern. Bridges and viaducts often lie on straight lines connecting these stars or serve as nodal points in this geometry. Star fortresses aren't defensive structures. Their walls are too low for protection against cannons, and their shape is ideal for wave processes, for receiving and distributing energy. The bridges were arteries of this system, transmitting energy, vibration, and information from one station to another. This was a unified planetary energy grid, wireless and free. That's why they're so enormous. Their size wasn't dictated by wagon dimensions but by wavelength and required resonance. That's why they stand in empty fields. Once, those fields were part of unified industrial or residential clusters powered by this energy. If this was an energy system, why was it stopped? Why do bridges lead nowhere? Because the circuit was deliberately broken. Look at many destroyed viaducts. They didn't collapse from age. Their central spans were knocked out as if someone precisely cut the wires. These are traces of war, not for territory, but for resources and control over energy. The victors of this 19th century war first destroyed the free energy system. Why? Because free energy makes humans free. If you have heat and light that you draw from the ether or from Earth's vibrations, you can't be forced to work for pennies in a coal mine. You can't be taxed by the kilowatt hour. You can't be controlled. The victors who seized the world after the catastrophe dismantled the high-tech nodes, stripped the innards from the bridges, leaving only stone skeletons, and rewrote history. They convinced us that coal, oil, and gas are the only energy sources, forcing us to pay for what was once the planet's gift. We look at viaducts and admire the masonry craftsmanship, not understanding that we're looking at de-energized generators. We're like savages who found a broken smartphone and use it as a cutting board, marveling at how smooth and hard the glass is. You've been robbed. They didn't just steal your history, they stole the future your ancestors had. These bridges to nowhere aren't monuments to the past. They're silent witnesses to a crime of planetary scale. They scream that a civilization of titans once existed here, ground to dust, while we were made to forget even their names. But if the system was destroyed, somewhere there must be control centers. Somewhere there must be those who press the off button. And most intriguingly, perhaps this system wasn't completely destroyed, just switched off. Perhaps these stones are still waiting for a signal to hum once more and begin generating energy again. If this video made your brain demand more, hit that bell before they switch it off too. Subscribing is your vote against historical amnesia. A like is a signal to the algorithm that truth still matters to someone out there. And if you made it to the end, congratulations, you're already awake. Welcome to the club of those who see bridges not as roads, but as messages from the past. See you in the next investigation if it doesn't get taken down.